Welcome to the PKU Life podcast with Kevin Alexander. Today is March 15th, 2019. Hello. First of all, I apologize for this episode being delayed. I'd planned to release it a few weeks ago, but I have been busy. This is my busiest season at work. I've been traveling a lot, working on video projects, and then this past weekend I was in Philadelphia working on the next Lifting the Limits for PKU video. I got back in town Sunday night, or rather Monday, midnight, and wanted to work on the show on Monday evening. And of course, my internet went down, and I need my internet connection to upload my podcast. And then finally, when my internet came back up, Facebook was down, my login to my podcast hosting service was down, Instagram was down, so I couldn't let you know that the show was delayed. So it's just been a very, very hectic week. But finally, here is my latest episode. I met Alison Reynolds years ago when I worked with her on a video for an event she hosted called Tuxes for Tia. That event was the genesis of a campaign I mention frequently called Lifting the Limits for PKU. Alison's daughter, Tia, has PKU, and Alison and her family have been great champions for the PKU community. And now she has a new adventure in the works called Crossing Norway, which we discuss in this episode. So PKU community, meet Alison Reynolds. So Alison, I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much for being on the podcast today.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, I was thinking about it. I always kind of like to introduce people to, the way I kind of look at these podcasts is like, introducing people to people I've met over the years in the PKU community. And I want to say that I guess the first time we met was in 2012 at the NPQA conference?
That's right.
Yeah, and then wasn't too long after that we started working on the Tuxes for Tia project, which we'll kind of get into a little bit later. But first, what I want to do is, anytime that I interview a parent, I kind of always like to start with a diagnosis story because everybody can kind of relate to that, especially if they're a parent. So let's just kind of start off with some background information on you and your family. So tell me a little bit about Tia's diagnosis.
Sure. So Tia was born in 2002, September 18th, 2002. At the time, we lived north of San Francisco in St. Helena. And the day that we got home from the hospital, I got a phone call from a state doctor in California saying, your daughter tested positive for this rare disease. The likelihood that this is a false positive is very high. But we need you to get into the car right now and drive about an hour away and get her retested. And when he put it that way, it became evident to me that this was serious. And so obviously the path to the full diagnosis, which was 24 hours later, that time was very stressful, very emotional. Spent a lot of time reading about PKU. The actual moment of the confirmation is clear to me now. I forgot about it for years. It was extremely upsetting. I heard from my dad. I threw the phone across the room. I was expecting to hear it was false positive. And, it wasn't. And so it was a life changer. There are many days where I think that we were chosen and that Tia was chosen. And, we're trying to do everything we can to make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I always like to hear these stories too, because, being an adult, I obviously don't remember when my parents heard, and I think it's something that everybody can relate to that, anytime, like especially on all the Lifting the Limits videos that we do, just that opening segment where we kind of go into the local family and their diagnosis story. It's just, it doesn't matter how many times you hear a story like that because everyone's unique and different. It's new every single time because it's a unique and different story. So what, here's a question. Had you heard of PKU when she was diagnosed?
I had not. I had never heard of it. No one in our family had had it before. And the town that we lived in, she ended up going to 2 different pediatricians during the time that we lived there. And those pediatricians had barely heard of it, barely remembered it from medical school, and had never seen a patient before who had PKU. So in turn, I ended up educating them. That's still the case today. Most primary physicians that you encounter, at least where we've lived, San Francisco Bay Area and Washington, D.C., have never had a patient that has had PKU before.
Yeah. And it's definitely something I've even run into myself. For the longest time, I never really thought too much about, hey, maybe I should have a doctor who at least cares enough to communicate with my clinic at Tulane and think about how, maybe if there's an issue that I'm going to him for, maybe it's some way it could be related to PKU. And I'm very fortunate actually that my primary care physician is a family friend. And so, I went to him a while back and said, look, I really need you to get in touch with these people and just kind of be aware of this. And he's like, no problem. So what,
Smart.
Yeah. And so, let's talk a little bit now about, you got the diagnosis. I mean, what was it like, transitioning into, understanding this PKU lifestyle and getting used to, what it all entails?
Well, I remember that I spent probably a week straight on the computer and, late into the evening, every free moment I could, from sort of, feeding her and taking care of a newborn, I spent all of my time educating myself on the disease and management and what the long-term prognosis looked like. We ended up having a family friend who lived in Connecticut whose niece had PKU. So I remember talking to that mom, and at the time the child was 10 years old, and getting, having her advice was crucial in getting to a point where I could feel like I could do this, like I could take care of this child, and in the long run, we will do the best that we could do on her behalf. A few weeks into learning about PKU, a flip switched in me to action. That sort of that moment that your mama bear instinct turns on and says, wait a minute, we can do something about this. We don't, what's out there in terms of research? What is out there in terms of treatments or a cure? What can we do? And our research showed us, my father was researching, my mother, I was, what we found was that there was very little research and attention because it was that rare. And that we looked at each other and decided we were not going to sit by and just, let this child grow up, with just the standard of treatment today, which had really been the treatment for the last 50 years at the time. And in our minds had some shortfalls. And so we decided then a couple months into her life to do everything we could. And when she was 1 year old, we presented a check to a researcher in Southern California, Ray Stevens, to support his research. And that really got the ball rolling. We realized, there are one or two projects out there. They need funding. They need attention. If we can raise money, we can attract more researchers to address PKU.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into my next question, which is, obviously with PKU, having support from friends and family is extremely important. And I know your parents, so I know they've obviously been extremely supportive from the day one. Yes,
they moved. They moved to the town where I lived with Tia. And my mom and dad have been extremely hands-on with her and managing her health and getting information and advocating for PKU, whether it's on Capitol Hill or for research. Fundamental in helping to start the National PKU Alliance. This has been, we call it Team Tia. The grandparents on both sides, the Pizzialis and my mom and dad are very instrumental in Tia's health. And now they live across the street from us in Washington, D.C., so they moved again when we moved, and I couldn't do it without them, no question.
Yeah, and let's transition now. You've already been talking a little bit about getting involved in PKU advocacy. So let's take me back to I guess one of the was I was reading your blog earlier today, and I'll put that in the show notes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I did not realize that the first Tuxes for Tia event was when she was 1 year old.
Yes, it was in 2004, September 2004, okay. And she had just turned 2.
Okay.
And, I started planning it when she was a year old because I had heard about a couple who lived in Mill Valley, California, nearby, whose son was born with a rare disease, and they held this gala to raise funds for research. And I believe it was Pompe disease. And my friends told me about it. They had knew people who had been invited, and it was effective. And so, We decided to do the same thing. Why not? There was great research out there. Dr. Ray Stevens at Scripps Research Institute was working on a molecule that had big promise. And so we decided to hold the first Tuxes for Tia in San Francisco, and it was incredibly successful. That was a big moment for me personally and for my family to see our community and our family and friends rally around this cause. In a rare disease situation, the burden for the most part falls on the family and friends that are impacted by the disease. And we saw that there was something to it. We could raise funds, we can make a difference, move the needle in the timing of the research that existed.
Yeah, and then so let's fast forward a little bit now. You held the first Tuxes for Tia event in California, and then when we met later on, we started working on a video project for the Tuxes for Tia event in 2013 in Washington, D.C. Tell me a little bit about that event.
So we moved to Washington, D.C. when Tia was 3, and she had essentially grown up in this community, attending the same small school that she'd been there since she was 3 years old. And our friends in Washington, D.C. kept saying to us, we're tired of going to these events where, the cause is not really connected to us personally or somebody we know personally. There's a gala in DC every night of the week. We want to go to something that's meaningful, and we love Tia and we love your family. We want to support PKU. Why don't you do one? And it was really our friends in the Washington, D.C. area encouraging me to do it again, and, staying involved through the National PKU Alliance and what was going on in the research front, realizing there was now more research attracted to PKU today than at any other time. There was important research that needed to be funded. So we jumped back into it, planned the next Tuxes for Tia. I spent about 18 months on this one. And then we held it in the gymnasium at our school. It was a free venue. I did everything I could to keep costs low. This is a real grassroots type event, and, raised corporate sponsorship, and had a silent auction, a live auction, a paddle raise for Fund a Need. And we blew past our goal. That was also another turning point night, I think, for us personally, and it set us on a path in the coming years, partnering with the National PKU Alliance to roll out the Lifting the Limits galas.
Yeah, and I'd also say that, because I know he's been very supportive of the PK community, and he's been to numerous events. Coming from a news background, it was just a great honor to meet Scott Pelley from CBS, and he's been the MC for a lot of these events, and that was a very great experience, and it's always nice to see someone with that kind of public visibility supporting our community.
Oh yeah, Scott Pelley is just a wonderful human being, and he has a big heart. He now knows a lot about PKU and cares about it a great deal. So we're really grateful that he comes to our events and MCs so beautifully.
Absolutely. So you kind of mentioned, a little bit about how Tuxes for Tia eventually kind of gave birth to the concept of lifting the limits for PKU. And, I post about it a lot on social media, but I'm assuming there's probably some people that may still not even really know what lifting the limits really is. So can you kind of tell me a little bit about the birth of the vision of lifting the limits and what exactly it is?
So lifting the limits is essentially a national campaign. It was designed to raise funds for the National PKU Alliance Fund, which was established to advance the science of the most promising peer-reviewed research out there. And so it was taking the model of Tuxes for Tia, sort of the structure of the evening and how the funds were raised, and how to rally a community around an event, and taking that national. So we branded it Lifting the Limits because PKU is largely a disease about limits. And we rolled it out in various cities around the country. I believe now we've had 7 different Lifting the Limits galas. We have a couple every year, and we find 1 to 2 families in a new market that have PKU and are willing to, help plan an event. The National PKU Alliance is right there alongside them on, handling the administrative end of things. And the whole notion that you're bringing a new set of donors and a new community to the table for PKU, and you're telling them the story, and you're getting them to open their hearts to the cause. It's an incredible thing. It's been effective, and one of the things that makes Lifting the Limits so effective is we really have one night in that city to make history. We don't go back to those donors every single year and say, will you please come to our gala again and again and again. This is, we're in Denver for this night, and we are going to make a difference for PKU. And that really motivates people. And so it is currently the largest component funding research today for PKU, for the National PKU Alliance.
Yeah, and on a little bit of a side note, I do have to say that, I've been working on the Lifting Limits videos that we produce for those events since the beginning, and I just have to say that it's one of the highlights of my, a couple of highlights of my years being able to travel and go to a couple different cities and meet new families, and I've interviewed so many people at this point, parents of children who've been diagnosed. And one funny story I have to share that I posted on social media about recently. So a couple weeks ago, I was up in Minneapolis and Wisconsin for the kind of refilming some new material for the video, and was with Christine Brown and her family from the National PKU Alliance. And I'm a Louisiana boy. We don't get snow here, but maybe like once every 5 to 10 years. And so just being up there was, a good experience. And I've traveled a lot and been to a lot of cold places. And so that wasn't new. But one new experience that did happen for me was I was leaving. I had to drive from Minneapolis to Wisconsin. It was about an hour and a half drive to where I needed to go in Wisconsin. And in 10 degrees at the kind of the trail end of the Arctic, the polar vortex that kind of came through. I had a flat tire and got to change a tire in 10 degrees. And on the side of the road, I'm sitting there thinking, well, something adventurous always happens on these trips, and on this trip, I guess it's this. But
that is really funny. Well, you got a real test of your of the temperature, didn't you? I mean, that is funny. Well, I remember very clearly when you came to Washington, D.C. and had dinner with us when you were filming Tia for Tuxes for Tia. And that was, I believe, the second time she had ever shared a meal with somebody else that had PKU.
Wow.
And that was a big moment for her. We live in a city where there were no other children or adults with PKU.
Yeah.
And she's talked about that before. It feels a bit like an island. And you were so warm to her and explained, your tolerance at the time. And I believe you were just starting Kuvan, and it was really helpful for her to meet you and share that meal.
Yeah, there's, we've talked about this quite a few times with other families that, that eating is just such a social experience. And when you have PKU and you always feel alone, anytime you have to either eat a meal with someone else, have PKU, or just talk to someone else who has PKU, it can't be, underestimated how important that is. And, one little brief story, we were on the trip, I was on the trip in Seattle when we did the Seattle video, and I was eating with the Haber family, and so we actually at that meal had 5 PKUers who showed up. It was me and
cool.
It was a handful of us, and it's just, there's a picture of it that I shared on social media, and it's just something that people easily take for granted how rare that can be sometimes. Well, now let's transition and let's talk a little bit about your new journey called Crossing Norway. You sent me a link to your blog, and we talked about it before, and I knew a little bit about it, but tell me a little bit about how this kind of came about and what Crossing Norway is. So
last summer, we found out that a Lifting the Limits that was planned for 2019, unfortunately couldn't take place. And so I knew that there was a funding gap for the National PKU Alliance. And I had been noodling this idea anyway, and also felt like, felt compelled to help the National PKU Alliance fill that funding gap. But I wasn't feeling it in terms of having another gala in Washington, D.C. First of all, I had told them, like Lifting the Limits, this is a one-time deal, friends. Please show up big that night, but I'm not going to ask you every year. So I didn't feel right about going back on my word, and I didn't feel creative about throwing another event in Washington, D.C. And since I had been noodling this idea, I called my dad, and he's somebody I bounce ideas off of pretty frequently. And I pitched the idea to him that, Asbjørn Folling is such an important historic figure in the PKU community around the world. He's the Norwegian biochemist. I know you're aware, Kevin. He discovered PKU in 1934 in 2 children. And the etiology of what he discovered has led to many groundbreaking further research for PKU. And it led to the research that created the heel prick test that essentially saved your life and saved Tia's life. And so he is an important person to keep in mind. He's an important person to honor. He's not well known outside of Norway. I also grew up cross-country skiing. My mom and dad are big cross-country skiers. My mom is known in polar circles. She has cross-country skied to the North Pole and the South Pole. She's pretty amazing, and I love it. And I had lost track of that sport over the years, having a family. And so I was thinking about something that would honor Dr. Folling, meld this sort of personal passion of mine and interest to give back and use it to raise funds for PKU, raise awareness of PKU around the world. And so I came up with this concept of Crossing Norway for a Cure. I will be cross-country skiing from the eastern border of Norway and Sweden across the country of Norway and hitting the west coast. It should take about 9 days to do so. And it happens I'm actually going to ski right through the area where Dr. Folling grew up, which makes it even cooler.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. We were talking earlier about your blog. Tell me a little bit about it. I can put a link to it in the show notes, but I'm assuming this is a way that you're going to be able to share updates with people who want to follow you and kind of see how your progress is going. Because when is this actually going to take place?
So this is taking place the beginning of March 2020, a year from now. I am actually going to Norway on Monday, and I'm meeting with the guide that will be with me. So it'll be me and somebody else, backpacks on our back, just us skiing across the country next year. It will take 9 days. So essentially, I've got to pinpoint the date. We'll take off around the first week of March, 1st or 2nd of March, and then should finish 9 days later.
That's amazing. That is amazing. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing some pictures from that when it's over.
Absolutely. Well, I will be sharing updates in social media. On Instagram, I'm at Crossing Norway for a Cure. On Facebook, the page is called Crossing Norway for a Cure. My website is crossingnorway.com. I have a blog. Blogging is new to me, and I'm enjoying it. I had some trepidation at first, but I'm enjoying sharing our story, sharing Tia's stories, sharing the PKU family story, because as you've said before, we really need to share our stories. It's one thing, you can have a loud voice and advocate for PKU, but it's when you share your story that it really makes sense to people. And I think that's when you start to bring people along with your cause. Yeah.
Well, Alison, I guess the last thing I would ask you, and you've kind of already alluded to this, but maybe this is a good way to kind of close and sum up. Like you just said, we all have to share our stories. We all have to advocate for ourselves. And there may be people out there who are a little bit shy about doing that, who haven't really gotten involved in advocacy for themselves or their child or someone else they love. Why would you encourage other people to become active in the PKU community and become active as an advocate for raising awareness for PKU?
We are, as a PKU community, one family. We are in this together. And the more of us who raise our voice and tell our story, by doing things like coming to Capitol Hill and advocating for better insurance coverage and legislation to cover the foods and formulas, and demanding more in terms of treatment and a cure. That is when we will really make a difference. I'm convinced that as a family and as a community, we will get there. So I encourage everybody to get involved. We support each other. We're in this together.
Absolutely. And as I've said before many times, you were talking earlier about, Tia, and when we kind of were eating together and just her, being able to interact with other people with PKU. I mean, it wasn't until I was probably 30 or 31 before I met anyone in the PK community besides my clinic. And, having lived 30 years kind of doing PKU on my own, and then living the last, 8-9 years now almost, actually being able to interact with the PK community, whether it's in person or online, it can't be underestimated how important that really is. So, Alison, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. Great to talk to you.
Well, thank you for listening. If you'd like to contact me, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links for all of those are in the show notes. I will be back soon with another episode. See you soon.